Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Roxanne. And Paul has introduced me a bit. I am a retired state government attorney. I spent 25 years in the executive branch of state government. And I spent a lot of that time at the Roundhouse on behalf of my departments that I represented, particularly the Department of Health, on public health and behavioral health issues. I retired in the fall of 2005, but not ready to hang it up. I've been actively retired, and so one of the things I've done is I've worked for the state Senate as an analyst during the legislative session. Let me give you my usual disclaimer also. So I am simply stating my opinions and beliefs. I'm not speaking on behalf of Retake or any other group or any elected officials I've worked for or any department that I've worked for. This is me in my capacity as a private citizen doing community service, basically is how I see it. So this is all, I'll take responsibility for everything that I say and do not attribute it to anybody else but me. So, okay, those are the introductions. So how many of you were here last November 29th, 2018, when we did the first part of this? It turns out to be a series, the lightning round we called it. How many of you were here? Okay, a few of you. Okay, very good. So that is, by the way, that video presentation that Andy did is on the Retake website under resources, I think, advocacy. How it works. Okay, so that was about 40 minutes or so. And Paul gave me, before the presentation, a series of questions that he wanted me to address. And we called it the lightning round. So I kind of hit these questions and hit 2 or 3 main points, and then we had question and answer. And so I decided that we're going to do part 2 of the lightning round. The format seemed to work. A slightly different topic this time, though. So I'm going to hit about 5 or 6 questions that Paul gave me that he felt he and the group wanted me to address. I'll hit those with a couple of points, and then we'll have time for question and answer. So the last part 1 of the lightning round last November was about the legislative process generally, particularly with the focus, because we were about to go into a 60-day long session, we call it, if you're not familiar with the legislature. So I answered questions like, how are bills drafted? How are they introduced? How are they referred to committees? What's the committee process? How do you testify? When do bills become effective? After they've gone through both houses and have been signed by the governor. So those were some of the questions. So Paul gave me some questions for part 2 tonight. So part 2 is we're going to focus on what's called the interim period. The interim period is not a legal term, but it is the commonly used term. Generally, it means the period between the regular legislative sessions. So when does it end? When does it begin? I have a couple of things that I'll suggest to you. But the important thing to remember tonight is we are in the interim period right now. And that's why I'm here now and not waiting until November or something like that. Because what happens during the interim period, and we're just at the beginning, by the way, so if you're concerned, oh my gosh, we missed something. We missed a little bit, but I'll tell you what it is. But most of what is going to happen during the interim period between these, the last regular session and the next one has not happened yet. And so the focus tonight is also on how can advocates like yourself get involved in the interim period, if you choose to. People often think, well, I'll just wait till the session starts, and then I'll call my legislators, and then I'll go to a committee meeting. And you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But you will have missed what we think is an important part of the process, which is getting involved now. Okay. So, when does the interim begin? So I would say it begins as soon as the legislature adjourns its session. But that's not quite accurate. Of course, being a lawyer, I want to look at the details. My opinion is the interim begins after the 20-day bill signing period that the governor has to review and act or not act on bills that have passed during the last 3 days of the session. This is all governed by the New Mexico Constitution. It's a technical point, but it really isn't until the governor has acted on all the bills do we know what the results were of the session that just ended. And then that helps frame what is unfinished. Do we want to go back revisit some of the bills that didn't pass. Are there new bills that we'd like to see developed? So it doesn't really matter. Either way is fine, because not a whole lot happens during those 20 days after the session ends, at least usually for advocates, other than to make sure if your bill did pass both houses, let the governor know whether you want it signed or not want it signed. That's important. Once the governor has acted, those 20 days, then there's a bit of a break. Everybody professionally involved with the legislature gets a bit of a break. And then starting in May, the interim process actively begins. So here's the first question Paul gave me. What are the interim hearings and how do they unfold? So this will all be in the PowerPoint, but let me give you the quick overview. So the interim period is between the legislative sessions, and the legislative session, also under the New Mexico Constitution, always starts the third Tuesday in January. So who's looked at the third Tuesday in 2020? Who's got it highlighted when the next legislative session begins? Okay, I'm a little compulsive, so I looked. So January 21st, 2020 is when the next legislative session begins. Now, since the mid-1960s, when the New Mexico Constitution was amended, we went to the current process that we have, which simply is, in even-numbered years, we have 30-day legislative sessions. So that will be next year, 2020. In odd-numbered years, we have 60-day long legislative sessions. We just had that. Now, there's a big difference, though, in what can be considered in a 60-day session and a 30-day session. And that difference is very relevant to what you might want to do in the interim, because I want to get into the details a bit about the interim process, but I also want you to keep in mind what are we going to do during the interim that will prepare us in advance for the 30-day session that will happen starting January 21st, 2020. So we are in an odd-numbered year. That's what the interim, the period that we're looking at now. But we're going into a 30-day short session. Okay, so the interim basically involves interim hearings by interim committees of the legislature. So the committees during the interim are different than the committees that you may have gone to during the 60-day session. The interim committees are much larger than the regular standing committees during the regular session. And another difference is the interim committees are composed of both House and Senate members. And the chair of the committee rotates every 2 years between the leading House member and the leading Senate member. There are 25 interim committees and subcommittees. There's 3 subcommittees, 23 committees. Some are created by statute. Others are created by what's called the Legislative Council, which is one of the committees of legislators, meets during the interim. It's basically the leadership of both houses. Now, you may wonder, how does a member of the legislature get appointed to one of these committees? And the answer is that the Legislative Council appoints. The House members are appointed from usually recommendations from the House leadership, the Senate from the Senate leadership. The members of the legislature are appointed to several interim committees, 6 or 7. I may wonder, how can they do that? How can they go to these meetings? These meetings, by the way, have started already. They started in May for some of the committees, and they're continuing in June, and they're happening this week. The next ones are Friday, and I'll tell you how you can find out the calendar. And they're doing what they call organizational meetings. So they are introducing themselves to each other. Some are on new committees. And the important part for advocates to know is that at these meetings, they develop, with the help of staff, something called a work plan. The work plan is posted on the web, and I'll tell you where to find that before I finish. And it lists what are the subjects that each committee will be addressing during the interim. The interim committees meet once a month, typically 2 to 3 days. During the summer, June, July, August, September sometimes, they will meet around the state They will move around the state. And so also in the work plan will be, when is the committee going to meet and where are they going to meet? In the fall, all of the meetings take place in Santa Fe. Not always at the Roundhouse, but mostly at the Roundhouse. So why Santa Fe in the fall? And it's really done for the convenience of the staff. So the staff who staffs the interim committees are different from the staff who staffs the regular standing committees that meet during the session. So I said that I was Senate staff for 13 years. So I staffed the Senate Public Affairs Committee, which meets just during the session, just has senators, and considers bills. This is the other big difference. As actual introduced bills, their job during the session, as you have been there know, is to consider the bills and either give them a do pass recommendation, DO pass, a do not pass, or a table, which kills the bill, or a no recommendation, which allows the bill to move forward. That's how a bill moves through the process. The interim committees, however, have two main purposes, and it's not about passing bills. They do not vote on introduced bills because the regular session is the only time that bills can be introduced. So what are the two things that the interim committees do? Number one is they develop bills that will be introduced for the next session. They develop them in a couple of ways. One is they hold panels. They invite experts and advocates and government officials to present on various topics, and that's what the agenda will tell you. And so it's an information gathering process that the interim committee does. So for instance, yesterday, I was at the Water and Natural Resources Interim Committee meeting. So in addition to developing their work plan and agreeing on their schedule, they also had the state engineers. Everybody know who the state engineer is? Sounds like it's somebody that drives a train, but here in New Mexico it means the chief hydrologist, if you will, in state government. And they had someone that I didn't even know existed. They had the state climatologist who was at New Mexico State University, and he was talking about drought and drought conditions. And the state engineer was talking about a variety of issues that the state engineer's office is involved with regulating, like water rights. So there was an informational piece. No legislation was discussed, but there will be panels like that throughout the interim of people who will be presenting information about bills. Towards the end, they start talking about bills. I'll get there in a second. The other important function of the interim committees is oversight. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, we know, in Washington, D.C., the federal level, about congressional oversight of the executive branch. So the state legislature has a lot less resources, frankly, than Congress does to do oversight. Remember, our legislators are unpaid. We're the only legislature that does not pay a salary to our legislators. They get per diem and mileage for going to meetings and participating in the session and during the session, but they do not get paid. And they don't have a lot of staff. So the oversight is done also through these panels. Interim committees will invite state department heads, secretaries, and their top officials, and they'll ask them, they'll have a presentation on a topic. Usually it's an overview of the budget. It's major issues that they want to bring to the attention of the legislature, what they're going to ask the legislature for in January in their budget. And then there's an opportunity for the legislators to ask questions. This is basically how oversight of the executive branch happens in New Mexico. They don't have lots of staff to go out and investigate. They sort of have subpoena power, but they never use it. So it's a lot different than Congress. One of the big misconceptions is our legislature acts like Congress, like a local Congress, US Congress, and that's not true, sadly. Our legislature, in my opinion, is very under-resourced to do its job, and that has implications that no doubt you've thought about, or we've talked about, or we will talk about. So that's what the interim hearings are about. So Paul asked, does the public get to comment at these hearings? If you've been to the Roundhouse during the session, you know that for each bill, part of the presentation of the bill is that the chair will say, is there anyone in the audience who supports this bill? House Bill 25. Anyone who opposes it? And there's a chance for you or anyone else in the public to get up and, you're not under oath, but you can say, we support this bill for all the reasons that were just stated by the person before me, or we oppose this bill. You get maybe 1 or 2 minutes. It's pretty fast. It's kind of like, I think, what Paul described in terms of, there's a limit. You don't have all day to do that. But public comment is not necessarily part of the interim hearings, although it can be. So when you look at the agenda for the interim committees, you may not see public comment, but you can ask the chair or you can ask the staff, can we have public comment? There's something that I would like to talk about, to bring to the attention of the interim committee. And that public comment needs to be short. It's a little bit longer, though, than what you get during the regular session, because that's one of the nice things about the interim process and the interim hearings. They aren't as pressured time-wise as they are during the regular session. You may have been in committee hearings for standing committees during the session where people had to leave to go to another committee, or they had to go to the floor, or they had to stop the committee because a floor session was starting. Those distractions typically aren't there during the interim committees. The Legislative Council, which staffs the Legislative Council Service, which staffs the interim committees, they're the bill drafters during the session, but during the interim, since they're year-round, they get to staff the interim committees. And they work on the agenda with the chair. They also take information from the public to bring to the attention of the committee. So one of the keys that I want you to remember is if you would like to get in touch with the interim committee that you may be interested in and have input into the agenda, you can contact the chair and you can contact the staff. So you may wonder who staffs the committees. And I'll tell you how to find that information in a second. It's on the legislative website, and I'll give you a little more information. 2 minutes? Okay. We're moving along. We'll move it along, but I hit most of what I want to say. Okay, so let me give you a little tip about the website, and then we'll take questions, because those are the main things I want to tell you. I didn't talk to Paul about this, so this isn't any surprise to him, but I would be glad to come back, say, in October, November, and we can focus more on the short session. Right now, let's focus on the interim, what you can do now. So here's how you can get information that I'm talking about on the legislative website. So how many of you have used the legislative website? I know David has, many of you have. Okay, so you know that toolbar at the top that has a list of things that you can click on, and you probably, those of you that were following bills, probably clicked on legislation and found individual bills or legislators. So there's a couple of those drop-downs that will help you during the interim. So the first one, not surprisingly, is called committees, okay? So if you click on committees, you will get on the left side all of the standing committees that meet during the session. On the right side of that page, all 25 of the interim committees and subcommittees. You can click on a committee that interests you, and you will have information about that committee, including who's on it, who are the voting members, and who are the advisory members that don't vote. And the votes typically don't really happen until the end when the committee endorses draft legislation, and that name of that committee goes on to that bill when it's introduced, if a committee endorses it, but that's at the end of the process. So, committees, a lot of information there. Then the next thing is, how do I know when the committees are meeting and where are they meeting? If they meet monthly and they move around the state, how do I know? So there is something to click on at the top there next to committees called What's Happening. Click on What's Happening. It will tell you monthly when the committees are meeting. If you go there tonight, you will see all of the June interim committees, which ones are meeting, where they're meeting. Click on that committee and you'll have the agenda.
And
then,
we passed out a printout of what's already scheduled.
Good, okay. And then on the PowerPoint that will be posted, we have this. Then the last thing to know, if you're a researcher, if you like to research, is there's also, you can click on publications. Publications have archived the past, by committee, the past work plans and the past handouts that were handed out. And it's there electronically. You can go back quite a few years if you want to research a particular bill or a particular issue. So there's information there. So in the 30-day session, let me end with this and then let's go to questions. If you have a concept, you can propose it to staff. You can propose it to members of the committee. You can speak about it in public comment. But here's eye on the prize, the 30-day session. What is different about the 30-day session? Two main things are different about a 30-day session, besides the length, than in the 60-day session. By the Constitution, Mexico Constitution, a 30-day session, there are two main subjects that can be considered. One is the main purpose of the 30-day session, which is to pass a budget. So budget, appropriation, and revenue are all three together. Any of those topics can be introduced and considered germane. Nothing to do with the country of Germany. The term germane, G-E-R-M-A-N-E, in a 30-day session. The second one that probably will be the major focus of this group as you go through the interim process, start focusing on specific bills you would like to see considered in January, are bills that receive what's called a special message from the governor. And in the PowerPoint, we will have an example of a special message. It's simply a letter. It's a form letter issued by the governor upon request, usually of a legislator, and it applies to a specific bill. So you can't say, I want climate change to be germane to this session. It's got to be a specific bill. And that bill number, not bill number like House Bill 21, but remember, if you heard the last lightning round, each bill in the lower left-hand corner has a unique identifier given to it by the Legislative Counsel Service for each document they draft, including bills. So it's very specific to a specific bill draft, a special message, and the name of the sponsor. So many of the things you're interested in that you want to be considered in the 30-day session, there will probably need to be a process of through a sponsor, through a legislator, is asking for a special message so that that bill will be germane. And so round 3 of the lightning round in the fall, coming attraction, we'll talk about how does the legislature determine whether a bill is germane, which there's a committee in each house that is responsible for that. If your bill is not germane in a 30-day session, it stays in that original committee and it doesn't move forward. So that's the main points I wanted to make. So let's do some Q&A, and then Paul will tell us when time is up.
We'll have just open questions initially, but then what I'd like us to do is to think about, okay, now that we know roughly what it's like, how do we use it? You know, what are we going to do? But let's just open it to questions.
Yeah, and ask questions. And in the PowerPoint, I talk about opportunities to have more informal contact with legislators during the interim. So we can get into that if you want. Yes, ma'am.
Could you give us an idea of the percentage of bills that are revenue and tax-based versus the special recommendations or requests from the governor?
The special messages versus how many are clearly germane because they're revenue bills. So you all know Government 101, appropriations bills spend money for a specific purpose by a specific agency. Revenue raises the money, taxes, to spend. So I don't know exactly, it varies. Could be 50-50, I think it varies. It depends really on the governor and on how many special messages the governor wants to issue. Now, January of 2020 will be the current governor's, Michelle Lujan Grisham's, first short session. This year, when she came into office, 15 days after she was sworn in, the 60-day anything goes, anything is germane, long session started. So we don't really know how expansive or restrictive she might be around issuing messages. My guess, personal guess, is that she'll be fairly expansive about issuing messages because she cares about a lot of issues and believes that there are solutions. The governor's bills will, of course, get messages. The ones that the governor wants to see happen. The governor's office will go to legislators and say, would you sponsor this bill? And of course, those bills will get messages if they need it. Now, a little trick here, and I'll do this also in November. You can't have a 100-page bill. Let's say, hypothetically, you want a bill that prohibits fracking, or has a 4-year moratorium on fracking, which is one of the bills that was introduced. And you realize, though, that was introduced during the 60-day session. But now we're in a 30-day session. There needs to be an appropriations bill. You can't slap on a $5,000 appropriation at the end and say, okay, now it's an appropriation bill. But the Attorney General has issued an opinion that says the main purpose of the bill has to be an appropriation, revenue, or budget. So you can't kind of pigeonhole your way through by pretending that it's really an appropriation bill when in fact the main purpose is something else. Yes, yes, sir.
Carbon pricing obviously fits in this category.
So I'm not going to talk about specific bills or issues. That's really not my purpose tonight. I'm talking about process. So we can always have that discussion offline, but let's just talk about process tonight. Yes, sir.
There are both senators and representatives on these committees.
Yes.
And does one group have more clout than the other in the actual reality of the committee?
So yes, they are weighted by political party, just like the standing committees have a majority party.
So it's party, not senators versus representatives.
Right. They are all together on one big committee. There are Democrats and Republicans. There are voting members and non-voting members. But there isn't much voting until the end when they develop, each committee develops a list of bills for endorsement. Endorsement simply means it has the name of that committee on the bill, on the front page of the bill, and it basically says to anyone who looks at the bill, this bill was vetted by this committee during the interim.
And are the minutes reasonably detailed and posted quickly?
Yeah, I think they're, the actions. There is kind of the unwritten rule is that actions are recorded as opposed to debate, at least in the New Mexico legislature. So you will see actions, and those are in the minutes that are approved at the next meeting, and they are posted on the legislative website for that committee. So you can see what they did previously. If you're in the Roundhouse, they have the same wonderful, I'm joking, of course, the same webcasting process. You know what the webcast cameras are at the Roundhouse. It's the security cameras, basically, in the committee rooms up on the 3rd floor. Now, they did install other cameras on the floors of both houses. But if you're watching a webcast of a committee from the Roundhouse, you're looking at the same thing that the security officers are looking at. That's why it looks kind of weird, like it's up there in the sky. And they don't pan. But yes, during the in the Roundhouse. But as I said, these committees during the summer move around. So they may not always be in a place that has webcast capacity. So you don't really know until if you can't make it to Crown Point for the Indian Affairs Committee, you may on that morning click on the webcast function on the website. You may not get anything because it may not be able to be webcast. Yes, ma'am.
Can the land commissioner carry a letter of request?
Can a land commissioner request a special message for a bill? Yes. Yes, and statewide officials also have the authority to ask for bills to be, statewide elected officials also have the authority to ask that bills be drafted by the Legislative Counsel Service. We talked about that in the lightning round part 1, how are bills drafted. All bills have to be drafted for introduction by the Legislative Counsel Service, and they will take written requests, Counsel Service, to draft bills for introduction by the 112 legislators and the statewide, and the governor and the other statewide elected officials. So yes, the land commissioner can request a bill.
I think the question was whether they're germane for 30 days.
So that depends. That depends.
Is appropriation dependent?
Well, so it has to either be revenue appropriation or budget. The land commissioner can ask for a special message from the governor for a specific bill. The governor decides. It's the governor's discretion whether to issue the special message or not. For the land commissioner, the attorney general, anybody.
So the land commissioner is just seen on the same level as the attorney general in the short?
The land commissioner and other elected, statewide elected officials are basically in the same position as the legislators. All of them can get bills drafted, and they can all ask for a special message to go on that bill so that the bill is germane, and the governor has the discretion to say yes or no. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
The testimony that's given during these interim committee hearings, is that testimony under oath?
No.
Even so, if you called in 10 experts, and they could lie their butts off, and it wouldn't make any difference.
They could, theoretically. The consequence of that is not contempt of the legislature. There's no such thing. But the consequence is you probably won't be invited back, especially if there are members of the committee who have been informed by advocates on the other side that here's what's wrong with what you're hearing. And there's, believe it or not, I think you'd probably believe it, there's a lot of texting going on between members of the audience and legislators. I've done it, and that's okay. Yes, ma'am. You're welcome. There's no prize if I don't call on you.
What are to influence the governor to reintroduce bills that failed last session?
So to reintroduce bills, meaning reintroduce them with a message. And there is, by the way, a third item
How do we
that
influence?
is, okay, I'll answer that, but I also want to make sure that I don't leave this out. There's a third item that is germane to a short session, but it's very rarely done. That is a veto override of a bill that was vetoed in the last session. So why is that not usually done? It's not because of the validity of the bill or the quality of the bill. It's because it's easier to do what you're asking, which is fix the bill. Fix the bill. If a bill was vetoed, fix it based on, if you're lucky enough to get a message that the governor explains why she didn't like that bill, is fix it, work with the governor and her staff and the sponsor, fix the bill and reintroduce it. And rather than override, just start with a new bill. So the way to influence the governor and legislators is the same. It's all the same. They love face-to-face contact, make an appointment, have a meeting, bring your advocates. They like to hear from their constituents. So if you're going to meet with a senator from Farmington, it would be great to have people from San Juan County there because they can vote in that election for that legislator. So it's the same. It's the same way you would influence, advocate, or lobby, if you want to register as a lobbyist, for a particular bill. Same thing. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a requirement that all these interim hearings be public and that reports of the hearing are made?
The legislature is subject to the State Open Meetings Act, and interim committees, like standing committees, are public meetings. So there are some exceptions, like if they're going to discuss a personnel matter, but for the most part, these interim committees are not hiring or firing staff, like, say, a county commission or a school board. So very little is not public. And the documents that they generate are posted on the website, or you can request it from the council service staff who is assigned to that committee. You find out who the staff is also through on committees, the list of the committees, and then go also on the legislative website to the staff of the council service. And in addition to their phone number and email, it'll list what committees they are assigned to. Yes, sir. How are we doing time-wise?
We're close.
Are we close? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Are the special messages posted under the committee on the website?
No. Good question. No. They're not typically posted, but they are public documents. So you may be wondering, well, Cliff, how did you get a hold of it? So there is a process, and I'll talk about it in November or October, of how the committee's committee in the Senate, which decides what's germane, and the House, it's called the House Rules and Order of Business Committee in the House. For House bills, the House Rules and Order of Business Committee decides what's germane. In the Senate, it's the Senate Committees Committee. There are staff who read all the bills and make recommendations to the committees, to these two committees. Staff gives its opinion about it, and I've done that process, whether we think it's germane, but it's up to the committee to decide whether it's germane, the legislators, the senators in the Senate, the House members in the House on those committees, and then if, they get a spreadsheet basically, and if whatever bills the Senate Committees Committee or the House Rules and Order of Business Committee decides is germane, goes into the committee report. Remember what I talked about? The committee report during the regular session to move a bill forward? The committee report goes, this is all during the 30-day session, goes, and it's just during the 30-day session. This process doesn't happen during the 60-day session because everything is automatically germane. Doesn't mean it's going to pass, but it's automatically germane. So if the committee's committee report in the Senate is adopted on the floor during the committee reports portion, then those bills will move on to the standing committees that hear them just as you heard them in the 60-day session. If it is not germane, it stays in the committee's committee for the entire session, and as you know, everything that doesn't get through both houses dies automatically upon adjournment on the 30th or 60th day at noon. One more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are the panels and the work groups doing work plans selected, assigned, or can one volunteer to be on a specific panel?
Okay, that's a great question. That's a great way to finish. So the work plans are developed by the staff with the committee members, with the legislators, particularly working closely with the chair. That's the work plan for the committee so that they have goals and also dates that tend not, that as much as possible, there is a legislative letter that has a calendar. So they try, yes, how could somebody be on 6 committees? And they try not to have overlapping meetings, but sometimes it's impossible not to have that. So the work plan is developed by the committee with the staff, but the panels are approved by the chair. Typically, the chair will say, Cliff, we want a panel on fracking and on, help me with the term, is produced water? That came up yesterday or 2 days ago. We want to hear about produced water. Is it safe or not? Find 4 people who are experts on this. They could be company people. They could be environmental advocates. And we want to hear pro and con. Is this a good thing? Should we be regulating this? And so the staff, so anybody can be invited. Advocates can be invited. Lobbyists can be invited. Government officials can be invited to be on the panel. And it's all basically the discretion of the chair. The committee members may say, I'd really like Cliff Reese to talk about this subject because we know that he's doing cutting edge work. So I wish. So there can be input from the committee, but it's the staff under supervision of the committee chairs who sets the panels with the approval of the chair. All right, how are we doing? So that's an overview. I'll be here for the rest of the evening. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them individually. As I said, with Paul and Roxanne's okay. Later, as we get closer to the 30-day session, we can get into more details about how the 30-day session works and is different from the 60-day session. So thank you very much.